Item number 12, Health, Safety and Wellbeing Update. Could I ask Ollie Sanandres, Head of Health, Safety and Wellbeing, please to come to the table. Thank you, Ollie. This ought not to be a contentious item, but you never know. Can you please speak to the item? And the recommendation is that we simply receive it. I'll move that pro forma. Have I a seconder for receiving the report? Yep. Councillor Darby, moved and seconded. Ollie.
Councillors Mayfield, thank you very much. A pretty straightforward report, really, which gives you a snapshot of Council's performance from a health, safety and wellbeing point of view. It is running slightly behind in terms of the agenda because obviously it flows through the Audit and Risk Committee first, so you're seeing it in 3 months. But as I go through the report, I will give you a very quick update onto the current day figures to date, just to give you some currency as well. The report does just provide that simple snapshot of performance. It gives you an update on the key work programmes that Council has at the moment for implementing a strong health and safety wellbeing culture throughout the organisation, particularly in the light of the changes of the legislation last year, obviously putting the governing body and Council as the person conducting business and undertaking, known as a PCBU, of which obviously you are all officers under and have due diligence responses. So this is partly to satisfy yourselves of the things that are happening in Council. The first thing I'd like to really sort of draw your attention to in the performance report at page 2 of your page 18 is the lost time injury frequency rate. This is a lag indicator, so it's areas where we have caused injury and where staff have been injured carrying out Council work, but you will note the downward trend since January, which is heading in the right direction as we and Council get a better handle on trying to mitigate and certainly try and manage the incidents as they've occurred. You will see that the report has the figure at 3.37. I can report that as of end of October, we're actually at 2.46 now. So we are heading towards the trend, and we are soon, fingers crossed, no incidents happen by the end of this month, we will actually hit the organisational aspirational target of 2.25, which is a fantastic sort of measure for Council because it means we are actually having an impact out there. So that's the first one to go through. As we carry on through the report, you will also see the ACC Industry Peer Group rating, which is a score which the Auckland Compensation Corporation allocate Council, and it measures two things: how well we as a council sort of manage our risk and how well we rehabilitate those that we injure. And the rehabilitation rate is actually made up of two things: not only those workplace injuries, but those injuries that happen outside of work as well. But obviously we as the workplace have to rehabilitate our staff back into work. And you will see that we are comparing really favourably with our sort of local government and public sort of regulatory services peers. The current score for council is at 0.7, benchmarking against what should be 0.9. So we're tracking really well on that point. The last thing I really want to bring the governing body's attention to is the implementation of Risk Manager, which is a council-wide IT system that helps us and allows us to manage and view the incidents that are happening in the organisation, but also to do the proactive stuff, which is what the legislation requires Council to do, to foresee and identify its risks and see what systems we have in place to control and mitigate, i.e. the prevention side of things, which is where the Act really wants us to focus. And I just wanted to bring to the attention of the governing body sort of our critical risks. These critical risks are the ones that we have identified that we expose our staff to, which, should they affect, would potentially end up in a member of our staff or contractors who are working for us having an injury which would be life-changing by definition, or potentially end up in a fatality. And this is really where the legislation really sort of tries to drive us to do. As you'll see, we've identified some of the key risks that are happening at the moment within Council. We have driving, violence, water safety and fatigue as sort of issues that are showing up. I just want to give the assurance to the governing body that everything that shows up as a critical risk has got a work programme behind it to ensure that we are actually identifying and sort of looking at these issues and trying to ensure that our systems are always sort of being developed to ensure that we afford the highest level of protection as is regarded in the Act. Finally, the wellbeing initiatives. Wellbeing is a very, very important part of the health and safety programme. Obviously, we run a number of initiatives very much focused across all areas of wellbeing, the physical space, but the mental health space as well. We are currently doing a refresh with our strategy, as I've mentioned in the report, but within the report I just give some statistics about some of the things that we've done. There seems to be a really good buy-in from our staff when it comes to sort of the wellbeing initiatives. And they're really well regarded, but it is something that we'll be looking to take on and develop further. And one of the areas that we will be developing further is around the mental health sort of field, because we see that this is something that is really sort of rising within council. I have no sort of further areas to take you to. I'm quite happy to take questions or for any observations to be made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. There's a lot of substance in that report, and we do have the responsibility of council as a business that's as a group that's an organisation that's conducting a business, so it is relevant to all of us. Councillor John Watson, I think we'll do questions first and then comments.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on some of those comments on the wellbeing initiatives. I see in the report there was a survey done for staff's mental, emotional and physical health, but only 27% of people completed that survey, and amongst those 27%, 1 in 4 suffers, I assume that's meant to be symptoms of depression, while 1 in 6 have stress symptoms. That seems to me to be disturbingly high figure of anxiety and depression.
It is, and as a result of that survey, that's one of the reasons we are sort of looking to review our mental health programme. And I think within the mental health programme, what we want to really try and bring to it is a better awareness of our managers, so they can understand sort of what their staff could potentially be going through. They could be mindful of the workloads that we are putting our people under. And that's not to say that we need to cut workloads, but we need to ensure that we are managing sort of the impacts of those and offering the right sort of services and support services.
Okay, so thank you. I'm glad to hear that's happening. I'll just flag a concern with that statistic. The other thing that concerns me is the low percentage of people who have responded to the survey. I know, certainly in any number of major institutions, New Zealand has a real problem with bullying, staff bullying. That's seems to be endemic. Are these surveys, are they entirely anonymous? Do people feel comfortable to actually say what they're feeling?
They are anonymous, absolutely. I don't know whether whether people feel sort of empowered to be able to go and take those, but they are completely anonymous. This is always sort of highlighted. They're in fact run by a third party, so again we sort of divorce that from the organisation, so that there is that sort of even better defence against that anonymity. So we do have that. But yes, 27% is quite low. We've got to be mindful of how much mandatory stuff we put on the business, because we clearly don't want to make everything mandatory. But we would like to give staff the confidence to be able to engage with these, because it's really the only way that we can have a view as to what is really happening within our business.
Sorry, just one final question, because I think it's important, Mr. Mayor. In terms of that surveying, quite often in other cases there are other organisations like unions who do their own health and well-being, and where people sometimes feel more open in expressing themselves. Do we also have any parallel type of well-being surveys or processes that are running it by any other parties?
No, none. The only other third parties we can pull data off that gives us an indicative measure would be any issues that come up through the health and safety reps, obviously which are their peers, anything that comes up through the PSA, which are obviously members of our health and safety committee, and the only other one is the EAP provision for service that we have, and we get feedback and stats from them as to the types of inquiries that they've been having, and they break down into mental health and various other sort of categories. So we have indicators, but no other sort of surveys. But that's something we could potentially consider.
Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Earlier on the report it talks about council's work, and that's including contractors, CCOs and volunteers. The lost time injury frequency rate, includes all those groups?
No, that just completely applies to council staff. Absolutely.
Okay, just And my second question is, there's quite a bit of variance in the actual monthly figures. We understand why January's 0, but bounces upwards and downwards of 30 to 40. Is there any reasoning for that? Logical, or is it just the way it is?
I think it's just the way that it plays out. Some months you will see sort of more incidents than others. We do tend to have, in some respects, we do tend to have a bit of a lag in terms of how they're reported. So you might end up in 1 month, you might have 3 or 4 incidents that should have been reported in the last month. So sometimes they do congregate. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that we always look for, Councillor, is obviously those trends, and we can see if there are seasonal trends. So you correctly identify a low trend in January. We would see if there are any other seasonal trends, perhaps. We always try and break them down. We haven't done so yet, but we could break them down through times of the day and everything else, just to give us that extra sort of intelligence from the data.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Just following on from the question of Councillor Watson around the stress symptoms within the organisation, do we have any information on any trend in that area, or is it too early to say? And is there any link with staff turnover that we've determined?
We're currently doing a piece of work around that at the moment, but no, we have no sort of link or trend information in that area yet. And
I'd assume too, but you could answer it, that there are corrective actions that we're applying in that area.
Absolutely. Regardless of the trend information, we deal with everything on a case-by-case basis. So anything that comes up either through our wellbeing team, then we obviously will deal with that, and the rehab advisor will obviously work with that individual to ensure that we put those corrective actions in place. And that could be a multitude of things. It could be giving them some reduced hours or some extra time or flexible working arrangements which the council has. It very much depends on the situation. Also, whether it's an internally driven situation or whether it's externally driven. It could be something they're experiencing at home, and we just need that extra support. But our rehab advisors will work with that manager and that employee to ensure that we try and make those corrective actions as fit to the situation.
Thank you. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the mental health concerns as well. And given that our staff are actually under massive public scrutiny, and elected members, there's no limit to what people can say outside and in the media, the kinds of threats or criticisms. Do we tease that out? Because, there might be, for example, if there was workplace bullying or work stresses, but there's a whole other tranche of stresses which are sort of, you could say they're external, but they're actually part of this organisation. Is there a way of drilling down into that in those surveys? Because I think that's quite a unique situation where people in other organisations staff members never have that, and that very much concerns me, because the only people that can really control that are the people that are saying it. So yeah, I'd really like to know. I'd really like to hear from our staff how those things affect them. We've had a recent example of that around the comms, and where staff were greatly affected by comments to the media, worrying about their jobs. They had no certainty, but you couldn't go back to the senior managers and say they've done something wrong. So yeah, I'd just really like to know how we can do that, or if we can do that.
I'm pretty sure we could in future surveys and tease that out. We don't at the moment, no. I think the surveys that we do are quite general, but I think you're right, they probably should be bespoke. It is a facet to our job that is quite unique. So yes, it's something that we will take back and consider. Thank you.
That's good.
Thank you. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to follow on from the Deputy Mayor's question, this report obviously relates to the council workplace. It doesn't relate to other council assets that we have all over the region. And so my question is really, and presumably any contractor has a health and safety regime in place which they monitor themselves. But when it comes to the due diligence duties of council elected members, do we have any oversight or responsibility for those assets in terms of maybe picking up on dangerous anything of danger to the public?
Yes, is the short answer to that. Under the Act, also any work that is done by contractors, we have an overlapping duty, as it's called. It doesn't mean we take ownership of all those risks. We hire that contractor, they have their own health and safety management systems in place, and they're there to perform that task. However, we can influence how they perform that task safely, and our due diligence duties do expect us to sort of manage how that project is happening. So, for example, asking very simple questions like, how many incidents are you having on that site as a result of that job? Are the staff that you're using on that site, are they fully trained? Some very, very basic questions we can do. And yes, the due diligence duties do expect that of the governing body, certainly.
So an elected member would be expected to make somebody aware, the contractor or somebody else would be expected to make somebody aware if there was a tree in danger of falling over a walkway or something like that.
We start dealing with some very complex sort of issues here. So, for example, in that situation, it would very much depend where the tree was, what was happening in the tree. If the tree was in a public arena, for example, and there's no work being undertaken, then the Health and Safety at Work Act wouldn't bite. So the due diligence defences wouldn't necessarily be in play. Obviously, this is a public safety sort of question potentially, and as a result of that, council would still be expected to do something, but the due diligence in the Act and the conditions under the Act wouldn't necessarily apply. However, if a contractor was doing some work in and around that sort of tree, it becomes a workplace. That then very much becomes part and parcel of the understanding that we would apply the due diligence duties and the Health and Safety at Work Act would then bite. But it's very much down to what is happening within that space of work.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Thank you very much. Well, there's a lot of interest in the report. Ollie, thank you very much for the comprehensive way in which you answered those questions. It's been moved and seconded. I'll put the resolution... Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to speak to it.
Yeah, sorry. I've neglected to invite people to make comment on it. Councillor Richard Hills.
Thank you, Mayor. Just want to thank you and your team for what you do. I've obviously got quite a high interest in mental health and depression and how we can reduce that across the city, but also obviously our staff are a big priority we can affect. I met with the wellbeing team and I can't believe it's only a couple of people working across, over 10,000 staff and trying to do programs right across our organisation. It's a tiny team and they're working under a lot of stress as well to try and get things right for people. But I just do want to say that I think, and it's a theme lately, that we need to be more responsible, and maybe it is, and we'll be discussing it later with the CEO, expectations as well, that where are our expectations? Should the staff be actually talking about how we make them feel? Because I don't think people really realise the pressure we and the media and the organisation puts on our staff, who every week get to hear a headline or a councillor speak about how they're bureaucrats or spin doctors or overpaid and underworked and going out. I think our staff and our team have a chocolate selling chocolate for charity for their own Christmas party. We're not able to reward staff like a business would, and that's fine. But we also are out there bagging them, saying heads should roll. People in this room say things like they're incompetent after they've done a couple hundred hours of work overtime. Yeah. So I think it's important that around this table that we need to be more responsible for our language, the way we make people feel. At the beginning of this term there was a lot of pressure on ATEED and they had a really high turnover and morale was extremely low. You go down to the offices and see what people are actually doing in this place for Auckland and for us. And 1 in 4 people in our organisation experiencing depression and 1 in 6 experiencing stress below, higher than the normal levels is actually not good enough. And I think the departments are doing their absolute best, but I see it. I go down to the floors and ask, and you can see the high stress, or after another story comes out that's incorrect, or councillors are bagging our own staff on social media. So I just want to say thank you for all the work you're doing, but we actually need to stand up and be responsible, because this is not good enough. It's not good enough in our city, but we need to be responsible for the way we treat the people who are doing all the work for us. And I've been shocked to see some of the behaviours that make our staff under extreme pressure, and then also there's no self-worth at the end of it. No, bonuses, Christmas parties, thanks that that a lot of other businesses would get. So, thank you for the work, but I think we need to be careful through the long-term plan how we respect our language around staff, and if there are cuts and other things to come, that we do it in a way that is respectful of them and their lives and their families. So, yeah, just thank you.
Councillor. That's really powerful. I will take that back to the team. What you're basically saying there is it's all around leadership, and one of the key things that we are trying to drive through the organisation is that culture of leadership, and safety leadership is no difference. So thank you very much.
Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, Ollie, for your efforts in putting this report together and to spelling out some of these issues that clearly confront the organisation. The issue of mental health, mental well-being is one that's getting increasing exposure in New Zealand, and as with our youth suicide rate and our incidence of bullying in our schools, it is one of real concern and should be one of concern in a big organisation like ours, and should it be even of more concern when we look at some of the figures that have emerged from the admittedly low turnout of the poll, but still indicative nonetheless. In my experience, governors are often rather distant individuals as far as most staff go. They could probably barely name who the people are, far less see them as having a meaningful impact on their day-to-day life, and I think that would be clearly the case for most of the staff that work for Auckland Council. What I would like to see develop here is, and I think, Ollie, you're certainly seem to be indicating that that's being considered, is firstly encouraging people to respond, so we actually know how people are feeling, and that they feel very open and able to do that without any fear of exposure, because that's often the difficulty, is getting people to open up, and when they have done that, then to actually confront the issues that have been identified, and in this case, 25% of people suffering from some symptoms of depression. I don't know what the national average is. I suspect that's quite above it. And then having stress symptoms outside a normal range. So as elected representatives, I basically have very little or any idea of how people as a whole feel with this, other than the very limited number of senior people that we deal with in this organisation. So I guess what I'm trying to indicate to you is certainly an interest in finding out how the mass of the 10,000 odd people who work for us, what their experience of council is. But thank you for your efforts in bringing that to our attention, because it is concerning.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Desley Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just want to add my support to other councillors following. I think, Linda, you started it really on the mental health issue, and I also congratulate you on saying that you're going to do something about that and make sure that that's going to be addressed. I suppose I'll ask one step further, if I may, and that is because there have been a number of councillors speak to this, potentially that you look at a heading in your report next time that deals with the steps that we've taken as a council to ensure the better mental health of those who work for us, if that's possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Penny-Hulse.
Thank you. And this follows on from Councillor Simpson's point. Mr Mayor, I think there's a lot I could say about this, but I might hold back a wee bit. When we come to our long-term plan and the discussions about long-term plan, I hope very much that we have a without fear or favour report back from our wellbeing group of 3 to tell us what the impacts of some of our decisions are. Our staff are obligated, they sit in those chairs down there and they have to say, yes, we can deliver. When we tell them to do something, and including our chief executive, yes, we can deliver. We can do that, we can make that happen. And then they go away and people are made redundant, people are told to do the impossible, and people then spend 100 hours that week doing it for us and prepare reports that we may or may not read. I'd like us to take a quite different approach and Mr Mayor, I'll be asking when we discuss in confidence with our Chief Executive the KPIs, that we have a really considered approach to our role under the new health and safety legislation. We are, whatever the expressions is, you know, persons of whatever it is. You know, we have obligations for the well-being of our staff. On the other hand, around this table and in the media, it's open season on staff, in social media and in the way that we treat our staff. So I think we need to bring those two ends of the circle together, and we need to not make trite and supportive conversation about this as we sit here, and then quite happily in the next item pick our staff to death, go in the media and say heads must roll, and happily exacerbate that and amplify that on social media. So Mr Mayor, I think this is time for us to take our role seriously. I'd like to see a consideration in the reports to LTP about what's doable and what's not doable from the wellbeing perspective of our staff, because, and I acknowledge we have a captain of industry in our midst. I'm sure that when you run large and successful businesses, you certainly make sure that your staff are equipped to do the job they need to do, and no one does their best work when they're exhausted, being bullied, or pecked to death by ducks, as my previous mayor used to say. So I think we need to take our responsibilities more seriously and give our staff the opportunity to be the best they can, because God knows they deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hulse. Councillor Daniel Newman.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. And as a person in past lives, have been on the receiving end of attempts by some to try and manhandle me in terms of my particular employment, I absolutely have sympathy for the need for good conduct at all time. I just want to really to reflect, I suppose, what Councillor Watson said, and say that the mental health and well-being of our staff is influenced by many things, not least of which, frankly, is the meat grinder of organisational change. And there has been significant organisational change affecting different groups in the organisation. And I reflect on the sad tale of some people who have previously worked in the library space, people who have been community advisors, but who are no longer in those roles, people who used to work in the park space, but who are no longer in those roles. And what I would say, in echoing Councillor Watson's reflection, is that you do get quite remote sitting around the governing body table, and it is quite easy to vote for recommendations requiring X change, but the consequences of what that means do not become apparent, and sometimes will never be apparent unless staff have the confidence to reflect in quite a front-footed way about how decisions taken around this table are affecting them or potentially affecting them in their future employment. I would not like to see a situation in the future where organisational change is managed in such a way whereby staff are effectively silenced through that process, because I think it's important that we accept that there will, if there is going to be change, that we do support those staff affected having their say, and having their say not just to the senior management or the organisational change consultant that's brought in, but also to those of us who are responsible for mandating that because of resolutions passed around this quite remote place. So I thank you for your report. I thank you for your reflection. I would hope that you can be quite expansive in addressing the impact of organisational change on the mental health and well-being of staff affected. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Finally, Councillor Linda Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I wanted to support Councillor Simpson, Councillor Hulse and Councillor Hills in their comments around the resourcing of our wellbeing team. Under the health and safety legislation, it is not allowable to use lack of resources as an excuse for not addressing health and safety issues. It's actually expressly forbidden to say we don't have enough money. And so as PCBU officers, we can't be asking for cuts in that area. And so I would like to follow up on that and Councillor Hulse's suggestion that in the LTP we really seriously look at that. I doubt any other organisation of this size, which is about as big as Fonterra and Spark put together, has a couple of people working on this. It is inadequate, but I'd like to see that we do get a report on this, because we would be abdicating our responsibilities if we just think, oh well, that's all we can afford, that'll do, because it's actually abdicating our legal responsibility. I wanted to just talk about some of the things that Council have said about the fact that we're distant. I do make an effort. You know, we go up in those lifts every day, multiple times. I make it my point to just speak to staff that I don't know. You know, they do know what is said about them, and they know who says it. They know. You know, and I think that we forget that they are people with families and homes and mortgages and worries, and that they work very hard for this organisation. And for most of them, working in this organisation means you take a much lower salary than you would in the private sector, because these people here love working to make a difference in their community. And they take, you know, they do take that. The other issue for them is that it was talked about confronting issues head on and, you know, getting them sorted out. Well, our staff can't confront elected members head on and sort it out, because there's no framework for that.
Not allowed.
And so we actually use our position sometimes, you know, a very privileged position, to be able to say things about our staff, right up to the chief executive level, you know, threaten to take them to court, all these sorts of things that actually aren't acceptable.
Point of order.
And
point of order.
sorry, excuse me. Oh, okay.
I
Please
raised the
rule.
point
Please
of order,
rule.
Mr. Chair. We had
I
a statement
have to hear the
that
point of order.
that some councillor has threatened to take the chief executive to court. Who's that person?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I'm just
That's a
stating.
pretty
Yes, yes.
inflammatory
Speaking-
statement.
No, I'm
to
just.
make.
I'm just.
Speaking to the point
sorry.
of order.
Okay. So I heard that on the radio, Mr. Chairman, yesterday. I
Okay,
heard that there were
I-
two councillors that were considering that.
Okay.
So I'll withdraw that, but that's fine. So
Please continue.
Yep, thank you. So for me, it is essential that we really look at that. We cannot afford to have our staff having to take time out for mental health issues. You know, these things are the precursors to things like suicides, and I don't want that on my conscience. So I think, Mr. Chairman, I don't know whether you'd accept just an amendment to say that we would like a report back at some stage to inform the LTP around the adequate resourcing of the wellbeing team, or you're just willing to take that up in your mayoral proposal, sir?
Thank you. I noticed the theme of the speeches that councillors have been given. I've been having a private conversation with the chief executive.
Maybe
about,
we just need more
about,
training
about
ourselves.
About that point. I think that is something that I'd like to get a report back on in terms of the adequacy of our provision, but it may be a case that there's not a simple we need 2, we need 4 or whatever,
Right.
But I think that is something that, given the concerns of so many councillors, we need to keep an eye on to ensure that we have an adequacy of resourcing of the team dealing with issues that are significant. So I think that message is being taken on board by both me and the Chief Executive. Finally, Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yes, just want to make a quick point, Mr. Mayor, and that goes to experiences I've had talking with staff members after they've left employment, in a number of instances over stress issues. And that just goes to the context of our council, where we are the only local government employer in the Auckland region, where the main local government employer in New Zealand, and the consequences that people have a fear of losing their job because they know that they'll probably have to go somewhere else in New Zealand to work and shift their family and so many other things. So the context around our organisation and what happens within it in terms of the fear of losing your job, the pressure, all of those things, I would suggest are far greater than any other local government location in New Zealand. And that is the context that is very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and thank you, councillors who have contributed to this debate. Look, I just think one of the messages that's been coming through, and it's about what I said at the beginning of this meeting, it's how you treat the people you work with, whether they're your staff or your fellow representatives, particularly for staff, because your fellow elected representatives can bite back, staff can't. So, you know, I just think the message that so many of you have given today, I hope is taken on board by everybody, that when we deal with staff, we expect high standards from them, but we need to treat them with respect. And remember that poor behaviour, abuse, yelling is never acceptable. I think that's a clear message around the table. Let's now walk the talk and make sure that we do according to what we've talked about at the meeting today.
Yep.
Okay. So, Councillor Rosscliffe.
I must admit I found it a bit rich listening to some of the contributions here today, but I would just actually like to ask Marguerite that in the new year when we have new elected members, if we could offer a workshop on the code of conduct for all elected members, so it would be a refresh, and we particularly just focus on clause 5.8, which is respect. But I think we need a refresh because some of the social media stuff is getting out of control, to be quite honest. I don't do social media, but I certainly read something. I read something yesterday where staff were bagged, I was bagged. So it's just getting out of control, and it's really not doing this organisation any good at all. We've been made to look stupid out there, to be quite honest. And staff are embarrassed to say they work for the council at times. So.
Thank you.
So I'd just like to know whether Marguerite would consider offering to all the workshop when we have the new elected members in February, March, that all councillors are asked to attend, have the offer to attend.
Yep.
I think that's something Marguerite will take on board. Sometimes we do need to be reminded in that way. Councillor Collins, did you have a late call?
Yeah, I just wanted to. This is a wellbeing report. I'm interested, sir, that the discussion has started to focus on particular comments. One comment that I made that I'm quite happy to own up to. It was my comment that said heads should roll, and I made that comment unashamedly. And because you're giving an honest opinion. The point I want to make is I used to be a public servant. I worked at the Ministry of Social Development for 2 years. I worked at the Ministry of Education as the Pasifika Education Advisor for 2 years. I spent 4 years. I was critical of the public service when I was in there, and some of you may have read the blog where I was told by my manager at the urinal that I wouldn't have a job after a little while. The point I'm trying to make is one of the greatest frustrations I had as a public servant, and one of the things I uptook was the Employment Assistance Program, the EAP program, which is available to civil servants at this organisation, was to be able to have the ability to reflect on how you were doing at work, how things were creating the stresses that you were experiencing. As a youth worker, I've always encouraged youth workers to take supervision, and I still get supervision now, and I'm an elected member. The point I'd like to make is that there are all sorts of support that need to be provided to staff. I speak as a former public servant, as a former lecturer at a university and Bible college, all of which had EAP available to people as one of a number of services available to people to get the necessary support that they needed. So I think, yep, sure, we can focus on some comments that have been made in the media, but I'm not prepared to accept that that's been the only issue that people are facing. And I would encourage, which is what this report is saying, there's critical risk factors around driving and violence that haven't been looked at, or I'd invite people to consider those parts of the report. So I think we need to look at it as a whole and not completely focus on one particular area. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion has been moved and seconded. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. Can we now move